Have you asked yourself the question, why do terrorists seem to hate Americans? Why do these radical Muslims seem to have so much hostility toward Americans and perhaps more specifically toward Christians? Well, I believe there are real answers to that question. For example, you are aware of the fact, although we seem to know less history than ever before in American public schools, but you are hopefully aware of the fact that back around 900 AD, 1000, right in the middle of the Middle Ages, there were a group of Europeans, England, France, Germany, some of these European countries right in the Middle Ages that thought, hey, we have got to go to Palestine, the Holy Lands, and rescue them from the infidel that has overtaken them. You see, by this time, Islam had spread up out of Saudi Arabia over into Palestine, up into what was then called Persia and beyond. And consequently, Palestine was largely occupied and controlled by Muslims. And so these Europeans felt that this was sacrilege and they needed to go on a crusade, a sort of a pilgrimage for the purpose of freeing the Holy Lands. And they orchestrated at least 3 of these crusades during a period of about 100 and 150 years, and they were largely unsuccessful. But you remember what the crusaders were wearing above their armor? They were wearing large red crosses. And so literally burned into the consciousness of the Islamic world since that time, over 1,000 years ago, has been this idea that Christianity is represented by this warlike desire to expunge Muslims. And I cannot overstate the extent to which that continues to occupy the thinking of terrorists. And they've displaced much of that hostility toward America, which is odd because America's only been here a little over 2 centuries. We were not a nation in existence during the Middle Ages. And yet we have kind of been held up as by the Islamic world. You remember Osama bin Laden literally referred to America as the Crusader. He was tying back into that notion that Muslims have etched into their minds that these Christians wish to see Muslims exterminated. A second reason why there is such ongoing hostility. Do you remember after World War II, within just 2 or 3 years, the displaced Jews, displaced largely due to Nazi persecution of the Jewish populations of a number of European states, even extending over into Russia, but Poland and other places. Do you remember those displaced Jews were seeking a place to light? And ultimately they came down to Palestine and carved out a piece of real estate, and in May of 1948 formed the modern state of Israel. And they did that with the support of a number of countries, including America and England. And again, I cannot overstate the extent to which the Palestinian peoples, and by connection, the Muslim world, is angered by and upset about the fact that Israel has taken that real estate, which was previously occupied by Palestinian peoples, and that they have done so with the ongoing long-term support of America and England and others. Now, I might point out to you that for good or ill, the fact of the matter is that that real estate was occupied previously, centuries earlier, by the Jews themselves. And so for Muslims to feel like it's unfair for them to be displaced, the Jews could make the argument that, well, we had it, many centuries before you did. Be that as it may, there seems to be in American thinking, and especially American politics, and there has been now for many, many years, over 50 years, the idea that it is important for America to support Israel. Why is that? Is it because there is a strong Jewish population in America that wants to support Israel? That certainly probably has something to do with it. There's the idea that Israel is somewhat of a buffer between the Islamic terrorists and America. They actually sort of serve as a go-between that kind of insulates us to a certain extent. In any case, there is an element in America today, a religious element, that is absolutely convinced that the Bible teaches that when God singled out Abraham and therefore his descendants through Isaac and Jacob and so forth, all the way down even to Jesus, that when God did that, He was placing somewhat of a permanent stamp upon that ethnic group. And that therefore God intends for that ethnic group to continue to survive as an ethnic national orientation, and that therefore God intends for that group to have access to have eternal right to the land of Canaan that God had given them when the Israelites came out of Egypt under Moses and eventually occupied the land. So there's a sizable segment of Christendom that has fomented the political support of Israel due to religious reasons. Now, we don't have time in this study to offer biblical response to that, but let me call your attention, for example, to the last two verses of Romans chapter 2. Romans chapter 2, the book of Romans makes very clear that in God's sight today, the only Jews, the only people that He views as Jews, are those who are Jewish internally, not externally, not due to genetics, not due to a physical circumcision of the male body, but rather, he says, it is circumcision of the heart. And in context, in Romans chapter 2, 28 and 29, he's talking about Christians. He's saying that the Jewish nation served its purpose. They brought Jesus into the world, the genetic side of Jesus' body. They served the purpose of preparing things, and then Jesus came and Christianity, the kingdom was launched. But for all practical purposes, they have served their purpose. They accomplished the goal. And therefore, according to the Bible, the Jews of God's thinking are those who are spiritual Jews that consist of all peoples, of all races, all ethnicities, all nationalities. God shows favoritism toward no one specific ethnic group. No wonder then Paul told the Galatians in Galatians 6:16 that the church of Christ is the Israel of God. No wonder the Old Testament makes clear that the land promise that God made to Abraham's descendants was in fact a temporary and a conditional promise. The Israelites were to maintain their convictions and their obedience to God, and once they refused to do that, they forfeited their right to the land, and no wonder then God literally Himself expelled them in the persons of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So sadly, there may be, military or other political reasons why it would be appropriate for America to support Israel. But so far as I can see in the Bible, there is no spiritual or biblical reasoning to do so. In any case, I cannot accentuate sufficiently. The Islamic world as a whole has great resentment and hostility against America because of our support of Israel. Thirdly, a third primary reason why the terrorists and apparently a sizable segment of Islam holds negative feelings toward America and the West. And that is because they see America as kind of the leader of the moral decadence that has literally gripped Western civilization by the throat. Think of it. Europe's further down the road than America is, but in the last 50 to 60 years, American culture, American civilization has undergone an unbelievable amount of moral erosion. There are so many people from other countries in our country today that do not know this. They come into America, They see the promiscuity, the sexual promiscuity. They see the drinking and partying that's done by our young people on university campuses all over our land. They see the high divorce rate. They see a national discussion about homosexuality. They see gambling widespread and drinking. All sorts of moral filth has literally poured across, spewed across our land. And this has been a significant alteration of American culture in the last 50 years. And so the Muslim looks at that, although I must say Islam has its moral issues, and I will point some of these out later in our seminar, but they generally look at America and say, you know, this is a decadent civilization. We are doing the will of Allah to inflict pain and suffering and casualties upon this society because of its decadence. They see our women as being immodest and promiscuous, and consequently, you know, their view of America is this is a pretty bad place, sinful, and they therefore see it appropriate for them to hold ill will against us and to do whatever they need to do in order to wipe us out. Notice then the Crusades, the support of Israel, and Western decadence and immorality. You know, I just about agree with all three of those. They have a point on all three of those, although it's unfair to pin that on all of us or to assume that America has always been an immoral place or that there are not still a lot of good moral people, Christian peoples. But that certainly explains much of the hostility that we see in the world today against America. Now let's turn our attention to another matter pertaining to Islam. This is all kind of introductory to just familiarize yourself with Islam before we turn to the real punch of our study, the Quran itself. If you were to summarize for an outsider the Christian religion, you could do that. You could do that fairly easily. You would speak of Christ and His redemptive role, dying on the cross. You could speak of what He requires of people. They must, obey the gospel. They must become Christians through the appropriate avenue, the means that God Himself has stipulated. They must then worship according to the New Testament. They must be a part of the church that Jesus Himself said He would build in Matthew 16:18. They must live the Christian life. You could summarize all of that fairly easy and give people the basic parameters of what Christianity is about. Well, it so happens that you can do that with Islam, because Islam itself has articulated what it refers to as the 5 pillars of Islam, summarizing for us very neatly packaged the basic doctrinal concepts of Islam. The first of those, the Shahadas, sometimes said to be singular, the Shahada. These are really a two-part oral testification concerning the fundamental, shall we say, the central 2 concepts of Islam. La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulallah. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His messenger, His prophet. Muslims believe that when you believe and oralize the Shahadas, that makes you a Muslim. That's conversion day. That's how you become a Muslim, to affirm the oneness of God and then to affirm the fact that you believe that Muhammad was God's prophet and the one to whom you should go in the Quran in order to find the will of God. Number 2, the second pillar of Islam, Salat. This has to do with prayer. Prayer that is offered 5 times a day. Later in our study, we'll examine why 5. Why not 4? Why not 6? Or why not just an indefinite number? There's a very specific reason why 5 times per day the faithful Muslim engages in prayer. And this prayer is very ritualistic. It is very elaborate. It is preceded by a call to prayer. It is preceded by ritual ablution with water. On Fridays, typically the Islamic community and a local community comes together at the mosque, and that's known as Friday mosque worship. But the 5 prayers per day occur on a daily basis. Number 3, the third pillar of Islam, Psalm. refers to what you've heard about, the month of Ramadan. Islam operates on a lunar calendar as opposed to a solar calendar like us. Consequently, Ramadan shifts as you go through year after year. It shifts around the calendar. But it is an entire month that is devoted to very specific rituals, including fasting during the daylight hours only. So during the month of Ramadan, you are to neither eat nor drink during the daylight hours. Of course, you can eat or drink all you want before the sun comes up and after the sun goes down. That is Ramadan, and Islam makes many different exceptions, illness and pregnancy and old age and so forth, that causes a person to be exempt from observance of Ramadan. Number 4, there is the Hajj. This refers to the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. You've heard it said that Muslims ought to make at least one trip to Mecca during their lifetime. But again, there are so many exceptions. If you're simply economically unable to do so, or due to your age or whatever, then you are exempted. But generally speaking, once a year, Muslims come from all over the world and converge upon the city of Mecca in order to engage in various ritualistic activities pertaining to the Kaaba, which we've mentioned earlier in our study. The Kaaba, of course, is this literally spatial center of the Islamic universe. And Muslims come in large numbers and they engage, as I said, in rituals, one of which is to circumambulate in a counterclockwise direction around the Kaaba. So large numbers of Muslims gather and circle the Kaaba. And there are some other rituals that they go through that involve commemoration of certain events in the life of Abraham and Hagar and Ishmael. But this is considered a very holy pilgrimage that Muslims are urged to attend to on an annual basis. And then finally, number 5, the 5th pillar of Islam, the zakah. This is a religious tax that Muslims are urged to pay, which is then used for the mosque and for aid to the poor and so forth, typically amounts to 2 or 3% of a Muslim's annual income. Now let me explain to you and describe as best I am able the activity that is involved in the masjid. Masjid is the Arabic word for the place of prostration. We say mosque. If you were to look at mosques that are built all over the world, especially in Islamic countries, you would find mosques as plentiful as church buildings in the United States. They're everywhere in Islamic countries. And they are built many different ways in terms of the architecture, as that has altered itself literally over the centuries. And yet there are some fundamental commonalities. The term mosque actually refers kind of to an entire complex, which typically includes an open compound in the center. So unlike a church building where if you go into the church building, you're in a room with a roof, whereas you might go into the mosque and you are standing in an outside court, and that too is part of the mosque. Let me describe for you various components of the mosque: the minaret, the muezzin, the mihrab, the qibla, and the minbar. If you were to see a mosque when it is specifically built for that purpose, now Muslims in America many times before they get a large enough Muslim community simply rent a building. But when they have the resources, a lot of which by the way is in fact coming on a regular basis from Saudi Arabia and other oil-rich countries to build mosques in America. If you look at a mosque that is built for that specific purpose, perhaps the first most visible prominent feature of the mosque would be the minaret, which is kind of a tower that extends up from the mosque, and sometimes there's more than one. This prayer tower has as its purpose to provide a location for the muezzin. This is the fellow that is selected within the Islamic community to serve as the one who calls the community to prayer. Many mosques still employ a muezzin. Others simply have a recording and they put loudspeakers up there and then play the recording at the 5 occurrences of prayer per day. But all over the world, at the same 5 occurrences during the day, the muezzin has as his role and purpose to express the adhan throughout the community within earshot of the mosque. The adhan is a very specific series of expressions that go all the way back to Muhammad's life and that are offered by the muezzin in a sort of a sing-songy fashion. He doesn't just say them, he kind of sings them. And I hesitate to do so myself, but if you were to hear this, if you've ever been in an Islamic community and listened to this, it sounds like they're just moving their voice without making any specific words, kind of a but they're actually articulating specific words. Twice they say, Allah Akbar, Allah is most great. And then twice they will say, I testify that there is no God save Allah. And then twice they will say, I testify that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. And then twice they will say, come to the prayer. And then twice, come to the success. Allah is most great, there is no God save Allah. So he sings that aloud for the Islamic community so that they know it is the time of prayer and they should stop what they're doing and go through the ritualistic activities pertaining to that prayer. Another central feature of the typical mosque is the mihrab. We would say niche. It's kind of it's a location in the mosque that allows the Muslims to know the exact direction, and that word in Arabic is qibla, to show them the qibla, the direction to face in order to say their prayers. And of course that direction is Mecca. And this is considered to be the most holy place in the mosque. The mihrab, the niche that shows the direction to face in order to engage in worship. So if you were to walk into a typical mosque, you would see the qibla. You would see the mihrab that denotes the qibla. And you're very likely would see a minbar. We don't really have anything like this in Christendom. We have, Christians have developed a pulpit, a location from which the preacher can speak. Well, they have a location from which the Islamic leader of the community typically will address the congregation or the community that is gathered, and they call that the minbar. And so once again, if you go from mosque to mosque around the world, you will see these features. Yet another feature of Islamic worship, components of the mosque, pertains to wudu. Wudu is the actual ritual ablution involving water that precedes the prayers. Ritual ablution, to accomplish that, you must have water. And consequently, the typical mosque will have a sadrvan, which is an ablution fountain. And again, if you look at these around the world, they vary. It might be an actual fountain. It might simply be a pipe sticking up out of the ground that has water coming out of it. It might be pipes out of a wall, spigots that allow individual Muslims to come to that location and engage in wudu. Let me describe for you wudu. What is this ritual ablution that a person is to go through 5 times a day preceding prayer? Again, very specific, specified in Islam, and required for all faithful Muslims. First, they wash their hands up to the wrist 3 times. Then they wash or rinse their mouth 3 times. Of course, during Ramadan, being careful not to swallow even a drop. Then they rinse their nostrils 3 times by snuffing water in and then blowing it back out. Then they wash their face with both hands, do that 3 times. And then they wash their right arm up to the elbow 3 times, and then wash their left arm up to the elbow. And then they wash their head by running both hands from the forehead to the nape of the neck and then back again. Then they wash their ears with their index finger in their ear and their thumb behind the ear. And then they wash their feet 3 times up to the ankle. And then finally they utter the testification, there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is His slave and His messenger. This is the ritual ablution that every faithful Muslim engages in prior to the 5 times of prayer. You know, I might just make one quick comment. It's interesting that Jesus Himself in Mark chapter 7 commented on the fact that the ritualistic washing of hands, you know, there's nothing wrong with washing your hands to cleanse your hands before you eat or something or to perform surgery, but to wash one's hands for religious purposes as a a ritualistic procedure that you think is necessary in order to please God and to engage in some ritualistic religious action, God does not approve of that according to the Bible. Jesus essentially said that's the customs of men, the traditions of men, and not something that God Himself requires. Be that as it may, let's turn our attention once again to Salat. If you were to go into a mosque on Friday, you would see Salat being practiced. And I understand that even now in large Islamic areas in the United States, like New York City, this will occur, even spilling out into the streets and stopping traffic. And that is, of course, where the Muslims come and engage in their ritualistic movements that are a part of prayer. These are offered, as I said, 5 times a day, designated by 5 Arabic words that roughly translate daybreak, noon, afternoon, sunset, and then post-sunset or nightfall. So those are the 5 times per day that Muslims engage in prayer. And this involves very specific rituals, starting from a standing position. There's one portion is a bowing position. The one that is most striking, of course, is where the knees are tucked up under the chest and the individual brings their forehead down and touches the ground. All of that, a variety of actions coupled with certain Arabic words that are uttered in connection and in relation to it. Again, I can't help but be reminded of Jesus' words in Matthew 15:9. Where human religious rituals are condemned. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. Of course, if you're a Muslim, you believe that those commandments are from God. And yet Islam has a number of rituals, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, the encircling of the Kaaba, the Sa'i, that's the back and forth movement between the hills of Safa and Marwa in Mecca. I won't just pick on Islam. What about all of the rituals of Catholicism, all the rituals of Judaism, all the rituals of Hinduism, all the rituals of Buddhism? Now, if God Himself has specified very specific rituals, then those are good, those are right, and we ought to do them. But obviously, there's a lot of ritualism going on in a lot of religions that cannot all be correct. God can't be the author of all of that. No wonder then in Galatians chapter 4, Paul said, now after you have known God, or known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire what? To be in bondage again? He said, you observe days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid for you lest I have labored for you in vain. There's the biblical concept. So we would have to go to the New Testament, find out what Christian actions God wants us to observe. And certainly one of the primary indications of Christianity is even though it has certain specific rituals, not a lot, but a few, but they stand in such stark contrast to the rest of the world and all of the religion that has been invented by mere humans. Our next study together, we want to pause and look momentarily at some of the actions that have occurred in Muslims' life, in Muhammad's life, examine his personal behavior, and then we will ultimately proceed to our examination of the Quran itself. If you appreciate this seminar on Islam and the Quran, you will want to read the book on which it was based, The Quran Unveiled. This volume gives a great deal of additional information not included in the DVD seminar. Also available are study guides that supplement your viewing of the DVD. The study guides, the book, as well as additional copies of the DVD may all be purchased at apologeticspress.org. or by calling toll-free 800-234-8558.